The air in the San Felipe de Austin town square was thick, heavy, with the late afternoon heat and the dust kicked up by dozens of boots and horse hooves. At the center of it all, on a makeshift platform of cargo crates, stood Thomas Barnett Bishop. His voice, a thunder train to command and convince, echoed between the raw wooden buildings. He was the very picture of Texan power, a firm jaw, eyes that measured a man's worth in seconds, and a reputation built with the same solidity as the fences of his vast ranch. He spoke of progress, of the future, of a contract that would bring water and prosperity to all. But his eyes didn't gleam with hope. They shone with the greed of a wolf already tasting its prey. Amidst the crowd, hunched not by fear, but by a weight on his soul, was his son, Caleb Bishop Bowie. Caleb was the antithesis of his father. Where Thomas was oak, Caleb was willow. He had the slumped shoulders of one who preferred to observe rather than command, and a silence that others mistook for weakness. Thomas paused his grand speech, the calculated break to build tension, and then he fixed his gaze on Caleb. A thin, cruel smile split his face. "Friends, neighbors, Texans," he boomed, "we speak of strong men to build a strong future. We speak of the courage of men like Travis, like Bowie, like the great Crockett." The crowd applauded, the names resonating like a hymn. But the strength of a land is also measured by the strength of its sons. And I, with sorrow, tell you that not every branch that sprouts from a strong tree carries its sap. The silence that followed was sharper than the north wind. All eyes turned to Caleb. The young man felt the heat of shame rise up his neck, but he kept his face raised, his eyes fixed on his father. He knew what was coming. Thomas pointed an accusing finger. "My own son, Caleb, opposes this progress. He hides behind books and daydreams, speaking of preserving dry creeks and barren lands. He has not the blood of a builder. He has not the fire of a true Texan." The humiliation was public, methodical, and brutal. Thomas used his own son as a sacrifice to prove his dedication to the common cause, which was, in truth, only his own. "He shames me," Thomas concluded, his voice now laced with a false sadness. "He shames the legacy of this land." Caleb said not a word. He simply endured. In his eyes, however, there was no surrender. There was the memory of a cold night, years ago, around a campfire. A man with a tired smile but eyes as lively as embers had handed him a small leather-bound diary. "Keep this, son," Davy Crockett had said, his voice rough from Tennessee. "There's more truth in these few pages than in all the speeches of politicians. A man's strength isn't in the noise he makes, but in the word he keeps." Caleb felt the weight of that phantom diary in his pocket. He knew why he opposed his father. Thomas's progress meant diverting the last river that supplied the small farms in the valley, leaving dozens of families destitute, to sell the water to a foreign consortium. It was an act of treason disguised as patriotism. Among the faces of the crowd, he found one that did not judge him. Hope Bennett Caldwell, whose parents owned one of those small farms, looked at him with a mixture of pain and admiration. She saw what others did not, the strength to stand tall while the world collapsed around his head. Thomas descended from the platform to another wave of applause, men clapping his hand, congratulating him on his honesty and sacrifice. He passed his son without looking at him, as if Caleb were just a shadow, a misstep in his glorious march. That night, as the town celebrated the imminent deal, Caleb slipped away, walking towards the silent hills. He sat beneath an old oak, the same one where Crockett had told him stories of the Tennessee woods. He did not cry. The pain was too deep for tears. It was a cold ember in his chest he knew his father didn't see. Him as a son, but as a tool. A faulty tool that needed to be discarded. He remembered a small flashback, a conversation with his father when he was a boy. "Honor, Caleb, is what others think of you," Thomas had said. "It's the respect you command." But Crockett had taught him something different. "Honor, son, is what you do when no one is looking." The injustice was not merely personal, it was an open wound on the soul of Texas. The very land for which good men had died was being sold off in pieces by men who used their names in vain. As Thomas Barnett Bishop smiled with satisfaction, the warm desert wind carried a distant sound, the howl of a lone coyote. But to Caleb, it sounded different. It sounded like a call. In that moment, he understood that silence, too, can be a weapon. And if you think a quiet man can't stand up to power, just wait and see what happens when the honor of a dead friend is wounded. The public humiliation was merely the beginning. In the days that followed, Thomas Barnett Bishop worked methodically to destroy what remained of his son's reputation. He spread poison in casual conversations at the general store, at meetings in the saloon, in whispers during Sunday service. He said Caleb was unstable, influenced by weak ideas, and that his loyalty to Texas was questionable. The boys got his mother's soft heart, not a bishop's backbone, he'd say, and the men around would nod in agreement, eager to please the most powerful man in the region. Caleb felt the ice of exclusion form around him. Childhood friends now averted their gaze. The blacksmith, who had once taught him to forge a knife, was suddenly always too busy for a chat. Doors that once opened with a smile now slammed shut before he could get close. Caleb's property, a small plot of land inherited from his mother's Bowie family, became a target. One night, part of his fence was torn down and his cattle scattered. The next morning, the sheriff, a man whose loyalty belonged to Thomas Bishop, logged the incident as coyote work, a sneer on his lips. Thomas, meanwhile, wore his impunity like a trophy. He rode through town on his black stallion, handing out promises and handshakes, sure that he had crushed the only voice of opposition. He saw Caleb's isolation not as a family tragedy, but as a strategic victory. Sometimes you have to prune the weak branches for the tree to grow strong, he declared at a dinner with the consortium investors who laughed and toasted his wisdom. Hope Bennett Caldwell was the only one who refused to participate in the moral lynching. She visited Caleb, bringing fresh bread and town news. "They don't see Caleb," she said one day, her eyes filled with contained fury. "They hear your father's loud voice and think it's the voice of truth. They don't understand that thunder makes a lot of noise, but it's the silent lightning that holds the power." Her presence was a balm, but also a reminder of what was at stake. The Caldwell family farm was one that would dry up. On a particularly dark night, sitting on the porch of his small home, Caleb was assailed by another memory of Crockett. They were tracking a bear in the hills, and Caleb, impatient, wanted to push ahead. Crockett stopped him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Easy, son. The most dangerous prey isn't the one that roars. It's the one that knows how to wait. Watch. Learn its habits. Find where it drinks, where it sleeps. Know its weaknesses. The hunt isn't won in a sprint, but in patience." That memory sparked something in Caleb. His father, in all his arrogance, had habits. He had weaknesses. He met in the same places, trusted the same people, and above all, underestimated his silent son. Caleb's motivation transformed. It was no longer just about clearing his name or avenging humiliation. It was about honoring the promise made to that man by the fire. It was about protecting people like Hope and her family. It was about defending the true spirit of Texas, the one not measured in acres of land or sacks of coin, but in a man's integrity. Each humiliation planted something new within him, something that grew stronger than fear. He began to watch, to listen. He let everyone believe he was a broken man, a pariah resigned to his fate. But inside, the hunt had begun. The arrogant Thomas Bishop didn't know it, but in trying to erase his son from his story, he had just awakened the wrong man. Caleb's transformation was so subtle that no one noticed. The young man who once walked with slumped shoulders, now moved with a silent purpose. He stopped frequenting the town during the day, becoming a creature of the night and shadows. Using the tracking skills Crockett had taught him, he followed not animals, but the movements of his father and his associates. He learned the routine of secret meetings in the back rooms of the saloon, identified the messenger who carried correspondence to and from the foreign consortium, and predicted his father's every move. Hope became his indispensable ally. With her reputation intact, she was his eyes and ears in town. Feigning interest in community affairs, she gathered crucial information. "They're signing the final papers in 10 days, she whispered to Caleb during a secret meeting near the river. "Your father is organizing a grand celebration in the square. He wants it to be a public event, so everyone feels part of the victory." Caleb's cunning began to bear fruit. One stormy night, as he followed the messenger, he saw the man stop for shelter under a rocky overhang. The horse, startled by thunder, reared, and the leather satchel with the documents fell into the mud. The messenger, cursing, retrieved the bag but didn't notice that a sealed envelope had slipped out. Caleb waited until he was gone and, his heart pounding, retrieved the letter. By the dim light of a lantern in his barn, he carefully opened the envelope. It was a letter from the consortium leader to Thomas Bishop. The words sent a chill down his spine. The letter didn't just speak of buying water rights. It spoke of acquiring the deeds to farms that would be devalued by the drought for a fraction of their actual cost. His father's plan wasn't just greedy, it was predatory. He was creating the crisis to buy the ruins afterward. But there was more. At the bottom of his chest, Caleb kept Crockett's diary. He opened it rarely, treating it like a sacred relic. That night, something compelled him to read it again. Flipping through the pages, he found an annotation he had never understood before. Crockett described a meeting with a young, ambitious Thomas Bishop years before the Revolution. "He speaks the language of liberty," Crockett had written, but his eyes tell a different story, a story of ambition that knows no flag. He asked me about the trade routes south of the border. A man who looks south with such avidity while the North cries for help is a man to watch. The final plan began to take shape in Caleb's mind. It wouldn't be a confrontation of force, but of truth. He needed one more piece. He knew, through hope, that one of his father's oldest foremen, a man named Jeb Douglas, had been recently fired after questioning the ethics of the water deal. Jeb was a proud and loyal man, but his loyalty had been betrayed. Caleb sought him out, not with accusations, but with a simple question. "Jeb, you fought at San Jacinto. You fought for this land. What do you think Davy Crockett would say about what's happening in our valley?" The old foreman, initially suspicious, looked into Caleb's eyes and saw not Bishop's weak son, but a determined man. He saw the truth. Jeb agreed to testify. With the letter, Crockett's diary, and the word of a war veteran, Caleb had his weapons. They were silent weapons, but deadlier than any rifle. The powerful laughed, thinking he had given up, broken and disappeared. Little did they know that the silence was merely the sound of the hunter approaching the prey. The day of the celebration dawned clear and unforgiving, the Texas sun baking the dust of the square. The entire town was present, drawn by the promise of free drinks and grand speeches. Thomas Barnett Bishop was at the height of his glory. Standing on the same platform from which he had humiliated his son, he looked like a king. Beside him, the consortium representatives smiled, their dark, expensive suits looking out of place under the open Texas sky. Thomas raised his hands, calling for silence. His voice boomed, full of false humility and pride. Today, my friends, we do not celebrate a contract. We celebrate the future, a future of prosperity that we have secured through hard work and difficult decisions. The crowd applauded. At that moment, a solitary figure emerged from the crowd and walked purposefully toward the platform. It was Caleb. There was no hesitation in his steps. His face was calm, his eyes fixed on his father. The murmur ceased. Everyone turned to see the disinherited son. Thomas frowned, irritated by the interruption. Caleb, what is the meaning of this? Don't come to spoil this day with your whining. I haven't come to whine, Father, Caleb said, his voice clear and firm, surprising everyone. I've come to speak the truth, with your permission. A ripple of laughter ran through Thomas's associates. He, wanting to appear magnanimous and prove once and for all his son's insignificance, shrugged. Speak then. Let everyone hear your foolishness once more. Caleb climbed onto the platform. He didn't look at the crowd, but directly at his father. You invoked the name of Davy Crockett to justify your deeds, he began, but I wonder if you ever knew the real man. He pulled the small leather diary from his pocket. This belonged to him. He gave it to me to keep. A murmur swept through the square. The name Crockett, when attached to a real object, held the power of a sacred deed. In these pages, he speaks not of wealth or contracts. He speaks of character. Caleb opened the diary and read the annotation about his father, his voice calm, but each word falling like a stone. An ambition that knows no flag. Thomas turned pale. Lies, fabrications of a deranged boy. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Caleb then held up the stolen letter. And this, he continued, speaks of the future you have planned for us. He read aloud the passages about buying the devalued lands, about how the planned drought would leave his neighbors, men and women who now cheered him, with no other option but to sell their homes for nothing. The crowd's silence grew heavy, accusatory. The faces that had admired Thomas now contorted in confusion and anger. The final blow came when Caleb made a signal. From the crowd, old Jeb Douglas walked forward. I worked for Mr. Bishop for 20 years, Jeb said, his voice hoarse with emotion. I heard him laugh with these men about how the farmers in the valley would be droughted out. I questioned him, and he threw me out like an old dog. The truth, delivered so simply and powerfully, was devastating. The consortium representatives, seeing the tide turn, began to discreetly back away. Thomas Barnett Bishop stood alone on the platform, sweat dripping down his forehead. He looked at his son and, for the first time, saw not a weakling, but the man who had destroyed him. He had underestimated silence, patience, honor. He's lying, Thomas stammered, but his voice no longer held the power of thunder. It was the hiss of a dying fire. No one moved to defend him. Justice did not come in the form of a sheriff or a gallows. It came in the form of 1,000 contemptuous stares. As the truth echoed through the square, there were no cries of vengeance, only a heavy, profound silence. Thomas Barnett Bishop, the giant of Texas, had become a stranger in his own land, defeated not by a bullet, but by a promise kept in the heart of a son he never bothered to know. In the months that followed, the moral landscape of San Felipe de Austin changed as much as the seasons. Thomas Barnett Bishop was not arrested. There was no formal trial. His punishment was subtler and, for a man like him, infinitely more cruel. He became invisible. His wealth remained, but his power and respect evaporated like river water under the midday sun. The men who once sought his approval now crossed the street to avoid him. His name, once a symbol of strength, became a synonym for betrayal. He lived on his grand ranch, a gilded prison where his only companion was the echo of his own shame. Caleb's true revenge was to live. He did not seize his father's lands or seek any form of power. With the help of Jeb Douglas and other farmers, he used the information he had gathered to renegotiate a fair water agreement, ensuring that the small homesteads prospered alongside the larger ones. He did not become a leader of speeches, but a man people turned to for honest counsel. His silence was now interpreted correctly, not as weakness, but as the wisdom of one who weighs his words. Hope Bennett Caldwell was often by his side. The admiration she felt for him had transformed into a deep, quiet affection. Together, they represented the future that Thomas Bishop had tried to steal, a future built on cooperation, not exploitation. The community, in turn, learned a powerful lesson. They learned that the true spirit of Texas resided not in the richest or loudest men, but in those who, like Caleb, held faith in the values of honor and loyalty, even when the cost was high. Justice, they realized, was not just about punishing evil, but about cultivating good. It was about ensuring that the land for which so many had fought continued to be a place where a man's integrity was worth more than all the gold in the world. Years later, children playing in the square would ask the elders about the great statue of a pioneer that stood in the center, and the elders would tell the story of a powerful father and a quiet son. They spoke not much of Thomas, the man who built an empire and lost it in a single afternoon. Instead, they spoke of Caleb, the man who sought nothing but earned everyone's respect, the one who learned from an old Tennessee hunter that a man's honor is not the name he inherits, but the legacy of truth he quietly builds. If this story of honor, courage, and the true Texan spirit spoke to your heart, please subscribe to our channel. Share it with everyone who is proud of their roots and believes that a man's values are his greatest strength. And don't forget to comment from which part of our great world you are watching. Until the next story.